Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. Bonjour à toutes et à tous. Thank you for joining us today for this Facebook Live event with the Minister of Families, Children and Social Development, the Honourable Ahmed Hussen, to celebrate the launch of Canada's 2030 Agenda National Strategy, Moving Forward Together. My name is Catherine Adam, and I am the Senior Assistant Deputy Minister for the Strategic and Service Policy Branch at Employment and Social Development Canada, and I am pleased to be your moderator for today's event. I would like to start by acknowledging that the place of work from which I'm joining you today is within the ancestral, traditional, and unceded territory of the Algonquin Nation. Je tiens à reconnaître que les terres sur lesquelles mon bureau est situé font partie du territoire traditionnel non cédé des peuples algonquins. On today's agenda, we have a fireside chat between Minister Hussen and 4 guests, grant recipients of our Sustainable Development Goals Funding Program. The SDG Funding Program is a grants and contribution program to increase public awareness, to support new partnerships and innovation initiatives to drive progress on the Sustainable Development Goals. La discussion avec les récipiendaires sera suivie d'une période de questions et réponses, au cours de laquelle le ministre répondra à certaines questions qui ont été reçues avant cet événement de la part de nos intervenants et des Canadiens de tout le pays. Before launching, though, into the conversation, I would like to first turn the floor over to the Honourable Minister Hussen to provide opening remarks. Minister, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Catherine, and good afternoon, everyone. Bonjour à tous. I'd like to start by also acknowledging that I'm joining you from the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, which is the city of Toronto. It is a pleasure to be with Gisèle, Yasmeen from Food Secure Canada, Vivek, Venkatesh from Concordia University, Paul Lacerte from Raven Indigenous Capital Partners, and Xavier Rosalie from Réseau des carrefours, jeunesse-emploi du Québec, and of course, Catherine Adam from ESDC. Je suis heureux d'être avec vous tous aujourd'hui. Today we celebrate the recent launch of Moving Forward Together, Canada's 2030 Agenda National Strategy, and recognize the incredible work underway by Canadian organizations across the country who are really championing progress on the Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs. Rooted in the principles of diversity, inclusion, and equity, the 17 SDGs set out to tackle the biggest issues affecting our world today. These issues include poverty, inequality, and climate change. It's about making sure that no one is left behind. Notre stratégie nationale reconnaît que la réalisation de progrès dans le domaine des objectifs de développement durable est une responsabilité partagée qui nécessite une approche de l'ensemble de la société. Our national strategy recognizes that achieving progress on the SDGs is a shared responsibility, one that requires a whole of society approach. It focuses on creating opportunities for dialogue and participation so that all Canadians are inspired and supported to take action and create positive change in their communities. Il s'agit également d'améliorer la qualité de vie de tous les Canadiens. It's also about continually improving the quality of life for all Canadians. This can range from meeting people's needs for safe, affordable housing, to food security, to finding a decent job, to having access to quality healthcare and services, and as well as having access to quality education and a healthy environment. Au cours de l'année, la pandémie de la COVID-19 a exacerbé un bon nombre de ces problèmes et continue de le faire, notamment auprès des plus vulnérables. Over the past year, the COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated many of these issues and continues to take its toll, especially on the most vulnerable in our communities. We know that seniors, persons with disabilities, Indigenous peoples, racialized Canadians, women and children fleeing domestic violence, essential workers have been disproportionately affected. Notre stratégie nous fournit une vision commune pour nous aider à déterminer comment nos communautés peuvent croître et se développer de manière durable et inclusive dans l'intérêt de tous. Our strategy provides us with a common vision to help shape how our communities can grow and develop sustainably and inclusively to the shared benefit of everyone. That is why our government is providing $60 million to support organizations taking a leadership role on the 2030 agenda, which means $4.6 million every year for great projects across the country. To date, the funding program has supported 88 projects as well as national Indigenous organizations to address sustainable development in their communities in a way that respects self-determination and reconciliation. Il s'agit d'une priorité absolue pour notre gouvernement car aucune relation n'est plus importante pour nous que celle avec le peuple autochtone. This is a top priority for our government as no relationship is more important to us than the one with Indigenous peoples. Many of the organizations that received this funding are here with us today, and I want to thank you for all the hard work that you do. Vous êtes tout au centre de notre stratégie nationale pour atteindre nos objectifs de développement durable, et nous ne pourrions pas le faire sans vous. You are all at the forefront of our national strategy to reach our sustainable development goals, and we could not do it without you. Your projects have helped advance community dialogue, create data initiatives to track progress, and focus on getting our youth involved in the incredible work happening right across Canada. I've seen how many projects you've already provided us with crucial learning tools, research and policy advice, and more. C'est ainsi que nous pouvons continuer à bâtir un avenir plus prometteur et plus durable pour tous les Canadiens. That's how we can continue to build a brighter and more sustainable future for all Canadians. J'ai également le plaisir d'annoncer que nous fournissons 2,5 millions de dollars supplémentaires pour une nouvelle liste de projets dans le cadre du programme de financement de ODD. I also have the pleasure of announcing that we are providing an additional $2.5 million towards 30 new projects as part of the SDG Funding Program. I can't wait to see what they have in store for us. Finally, I'm pleased to welcome 4 guests from our current roster of SDG Funding Program recipients and partners who will share a little bit more about the work that they're doing to advance the sustainable development goals in Canada. Once again, thank you very much for the work that you do. Merci beaucoup tout le monde.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Ministre, pour ces remarques d'ouverture. C'est bien apprécié. It's now time for me to introduce the 4 guests who Minister Hussen has mentioned, who are here today to speak about their organization's projects that were funded through the SDG Funding Program. Our first guest is Gisèle Yasmeen, Executive Director of Food Secure Canada. Gisèle brings a deep food system lens to her work and started working on agri-food issues in both Asia and Canada in the early 1990s. Food Secure Canada is leading a project called Sustainable Food Systems and the SDGs, Integrating Civil Society and Indigenous Knowledge. Our second guest is Professor Vivek Venkatesh. Vivek is a UNESCO co-chair in the Prevention of Radicalization and Violent Extremism, a professor of inclusive practices in the visual arts in Concordia's Department of Art Education, and the director of Project Someone, which stands for Social Media Education Every Day. Project Someone is helping to advance the SDGs by helping to build awareness and create spaces for multicultural dialogue to combat discrimination and online hate. We also have with us today Managing Partner Paul Lacerte from Raven Indigenous Capital Partners. Métis negotiator and entrepreneur Paul Lacerte is bringing full economic citizenship to historically excluded Indigenous populations, democratizing access to capital, information, and sustainable wealth. Paul has developed a new model for Indigenous economic growth. In 2017, he and two partners co-founded the Raven Group, which includes Canada's first Indigenous venture capital intermediary and the Raven Indigenous Impact Fund, the first of its kind in Canada. Their SDG Funding Program project is developing methodologies by which traditional knowledge can be used or embedded in the social finance process in ways that align with the social development goals. Et finalement, notre quatrième invité est Monsieur Xavier Rosalie. Xavier est responsable du développement du Réseau des carrefours jeunesse-emploi du Québec. Engagé depuis plus de 10 ans sur les questions d'implication citoyenne de l'éducation populaire, il a initié et soutenu de nombreux projets citoyens pour les populations en situation de vulnérabilité. Xavier est chargé de projet Ma Voix compte au sein de RCGEQ, qui vise à établir des partenariats intersectoriels pour soutenir les objectifs de développement durable en consultant les jeunes de 110 succursales des carrefours jeunesse-emploi du Québec et leurs partenaires. Bienvenue Gisèle, Vivek, Paul et Xavier, et merci d'être avec nous aujourd'hui. Welcome Gisèle, Vivek, Paul and Xavier, and thank you so much for being with us here today. I would now like to turn the floor back over to Minister Hussen, who has a few questions for our guests. And Minister, the floor again is yours.
Thank you very much, Catherine, and I want to thank you very much for helping us to moderate this important discussion. I want to start with, my first question is for Ms. Gisèle, Yasmeen from Food Secure Canada. Gisèle, how does Food Secure Canada's SDG project, Sustainable Development, Sustainable Food Systems and the SDGs help advance equitable access in developing policies around food security? And how does this contribute to achieving the SDGs in Canada?
Haïchka, merci. Thank you, Minister Hussen. I'm honored to join you here from the territories of the Coast Salish peoples. And specifically, where I am in Richmond, BC, is the territory of the Musqueam, who have stewarded over these lands and waters since time immemorial. To answer your question, I have 3 points. First, the slogan of the Sustainable Development Goals is leave no one behind. And as you mentioned in your remarks, unfortunately, food security has very disproportionate impacts on certain groups in society. If we look just at goal 2, for example, which is about zero hunger, improving nutrition, and promoting sustainable agriculture, we have a lot of work to do. Unfortunately, even before COVID-19, we knew that in a wealthy country like Canada, half of all First Nations families were food insecure, and Black households were 3.5 times more likely to be food insecure than white households. So overall, the trends were not going well in general either. And those are from the best statistics in the country by Valerie Turasuk at University of Toronto. Our project has 3 pillars. One is to support Indigenous food sovereignty. And that's a concept that goes beyond food security, to recognize that First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples must have control over their own food systems. And this is something that has to redress the negative impacts of colonialism over generations. And we see this work as being led by our brothers and sisters who are First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. And there are many concepts that are useful for this work, such as ethical space, which we have been exploring, but also it's also a time in history where we need the wisdom of Indigenous communities when we think of stewardship over biodiversity, for example. Secondly, we'll be working with communities across Canada in terms of ensuring more equitable access to healthy and sustainable food. So again, food should be seen as an entitlement not a commodity, just like any other type of good or service. And Canadians who are marginalized by income, by class, by ethnicity, by race, etc., gender, is something that needs to be tackled. We've celebrated the Food Guide, Canada Food Guide, which all Canadians need to have access for. So this involves tackling systemic racism, colonialism, sexism, etc. And we're working with the Coalition for Healthy School Food to advance a national school food program. Canada is the only G7 country without one. We have been criticized by UNICEF on child nutrition. This is time, as per budget 2019, for the federal government to work with the provinces and municipalities and other stakeholders to advance this, particularly as we move towards economic recovery. So those are my points for that question. Thank you. Merci.
Merci Gisèle pour ta réponse et pour ton point de vue et ton travail sur cette question très importante. I really want to thank you for your insight and your views on and your work on a really, really important issue. I completely agree with you that that food must be seen as a basic human right, and government policy has to be informed from that basic launching point and default position. And in addition to of course the response of using food banks, we also need to empower people by providing them with the tools necessary to succeed, with the help that they need to feed themselves, and not just look at food banks as one of the solutions, as important as they are. And I really also I'm very, very much touched by the point that you made with respect to history and its impact on communities, whether it's colonialism or systemic discrimination and barriers that prevent people from fulfilling their true potential. My next question is for Vivek Venkatesh from Concordia. There's been quite a bit of public discourse around systemic and institutional racism, and what I also call institutional barriers that prevent people from really succeeding and contributing to their full potential. And I'm wondering if you can tell us how Project Someone is developing community-oriented solutions that challenge discrimination, and how this contributes to achieving the SDGs in Canada.
Thank you, Minister Hussen. Merci beaucoup. Et je tiens aussi à reconnaître que je vis et je travaille sur les territoires non cédés de Tiohtià:ke, ou ce qu'on appelle Montréal, ici au Québec. This is a really important point that you make, and Project Someone has been in a very privileged position to have taken a community-facing and a participatory action research framework. So what we want to do is we are devoting ourselves to the reduction of hate and discrimination as precursors to phenomena like violent extremism. But we do this as a function of education through critical digital literacy. And so how that happens is, as Catherine pointed out, we are looking to create spaces for pluralistic dialogue. And these are embedded through various kinds of curricular modules. We work on multimedia presentations, online courses, but also through community-developed and community-created artistic installations and performances. For the purpose of the present project, which we're very, very grateful for in terms of the funding from ESDC, from the Government of Canada, I'd like to state that we are collaborating with some key persons, key community members and persons in Chicoutimi and in Edmonton. So we're working with Lacerte en transmission culturelle chez les premiers peuples comme dynamique de mieux-être et d'empowerment. These are Elizabeth Kane and Matthew Cook from the Université du Québec à Chicoutimi, as well as from the Faculty of Native Studies at the University of Alberta with Paul Garot and Nikki Lugosi and their partners. And what we've wanted to do here really is ensure that we can co-create and collaborate in terms of looking at how workshops that magnify the narratives of Indigenous and racialized communities can in fact be brought to the forefront. And we do this through sustainably empowering these communities. So in terms of SDGs 4, like quality education, and 5, gender equality, we're really focused on ensuring that the voices of the vulnerable and marginalized populations that research has borne out are able to participate as equally as possible in discussions. We're also, as a research creation and as an artistic unit, we also create documentaries and podcasts and multimedia materials, which we want to integrate in our open online tools, in our open online courses. And so this is also part of the broad notion of social pedagogy that we're building in terms of creating resilience to discrimination. And finally, I think it's really important that the work that we do that's publicly funded is driven back and feeds back into public policy that our municipal, provincial, and federal governments are engaged in. So we'll be publishing policy briefs based on the varieties of consultations that we're making, but also in terms of analyses of public conversations, whether it happens through social media or through town halls. So this is what we're doing in order to combat some of the systemic discrimination that Indigenous and marginalized populations have been facing. Thanks again.
Merci beaucoup pour votre travail sur ce sujet et pour avoir partagé votre expertise. La question du démantèlement du racisme et de la discrimination systémique est une priorité pour notre gouvernement et pour moi personnellement. I really like how the last point that you made about taking that research and that analysis and those results and feeding it into the policy making infrastructure. That's something that I think is very, very critical, because that's how you make a difference in people's lives. And I'm really grateful that you're doing that, because you know, when that research and those results and that analysis comes out of academia and goes into the hands of policymakers and government officials, it then has a fighting chance of making a difference on the ground. And I say that as someone who has seen firsthand the effects of discrimination, the effects of racism firsthand, in law enforcement, in the justice system, in the education system, in the healthcare system, and all these systems that are around us. And I think the work that you're doing is crucial in enabling everyday Canadians to see that the work to dismantle systemic racism entails an element of also personal responsibility to go beyond saying I'm not racist, to actually being actively anti-racist, to work towards contributing each other's parts to building a more inclusive society. And that really means dismantling these barriers. And it's not just about protecting people from discrimination, it's also about removing barriers that are holding people back from contributing to our common prosperity. And so it's interesting how, you know, there's interconnectedness between all those points. But I also think that the education and the engagement you're doing is crucial to also confront hate and confront movements and ideas that pull us apart as opposed to bring us together. So I really want to thank you for your insight that you shared with us. Let's turn next to our next guest, Paul Lacerte from Raven Indigenous Capital Partners, to talk about social finance and economic reconciliation in Canada, economic development for Black, Indigenous, and racialized Canadians, economic development for women, economic development for Canadians with disabilities, economic development for vulnerable people. So Paul, if you can briefly describe your initiative and tell us from your perspective, what is the link between the SDGs, social finance, and reconciliation? Really interesting topic, and I want to hear your perspective on that. Thank you.
And thank you so much, Minister. It's an honor to be here with my fellow panelists. I wanted to just share my gratitude for the appreciation and an acknowledgement of Indigenous ways of knowing and being. In that context, I wanted to say in my own traditional Indigenous language, Andakash Gayasta Kananado San Paula Sert Satni Injan Keo Yas Til Takne Saunanai Tbeu Sin and Dadandins Injan Hurloch. I'm joining you from the traditional lands of the Lakwangan speaking people, but I'm a first generation residential school survivor. My dad went to the Lajak residential school, and my late first wife also went to that same residential school, and I'm a day school survivor. So this is real-time transformation that I am living in this country. And it's very meaningful for us to be having this discussion where we're pivoting the narrative around Indigenous epistemology from a deficit lens to an asset lens. And I'm really grateful for that. You know, Minister, you know, the contribution from the Government of Canada to help Raven Indigenous Capital Partners advance our work around the SDGs. You know, our project has been focused on the design and implementation of an impact framework. And our impact framework this capacity has really allowed us to align with the IRIS indicators from the Global Impact Investing Network, with the Impact Management Project, with the Common Approach here in Canada, and to really help us quantify our collective contribution from within our portfolio of invested Indigenous enterprises towards the SDG 2030 goals. And so that capacity building, I think, is still emergent and absolutely crucial. And I think it's really important in this context actually to strengthen our accountability to the level of rigor around our impact measurement, so that the underlying assumptions of people in power and influence don't continue to be reinvented and reinforced as a form of imperialism thinly veiled by benevolence. And our accountability is to really understand from the perspective of the people that we are in service of and the territories that we're in service of, those specific metrics. And so this is where the capacity building has really become incredibly valuable to us, and given us the ability to really hear from people at a community level and build that capacity to design indicators that make sense for people at, you know, the real people that we're in service of. And I think in that spirit, you know, social finance really, as has been mentioned, really almost has kind of almost like an epistemology of its own. The idea that these blended returns to a pathway for a healthier and more equitable future for the people and our territories in this country is not only possible, but long overdue. And I would say, you know, from my own perspective, from the perspective of Raven Indigenous Capital Partners and many players in the Indigenous social finance ecosystem, we see like a really important and powerful and beautiful deep values alignment between this idea of the emerging social economy, the burgeoning social economy in Canada, and Indigenous epistemology, which is ultimately that we're all relatives. This is the core of our way of thinking, that we on this screen, the people watching, that as Canadians, we're all relatives, and that we're relatives with each other, and we're relatives with all of the things in the natural world, and we're relatives with the spirit world. And that if we shift to that epistemological core, that we're going to treat each other with more love, that we're going to treat each other with more respect. And I think that means between us as genders, and between us as generations. And I think between us and the natural world, and us in the spirit world. And that's where I think that all of this, Minister, to your question, really ties to the spirit of reconciliation. It's this incredibly powerful and generative framework that allows us to sort of reimagine and reinvent and reinform the relational space between us. You know, and there's a lot of healing that is needed in the space between us as Indigenous and non-Indigenous Canadians, but also between us as genders, all the way along the gender continuum, between us and the ancestral world, and between us and the natural world. And as I did earlier, Minister, I wanted, since we're talking about the 2030 SDG goals, and we're thinking generationally, I wanted to bring in the name of my young granddaughter, Cedar Bear. She's 2 years old. And she is who I am standing for today. So thank you for the chance to share a few words.
Excellent reflections, Paul. And, you know, one of the things that that always strikes me, even though I've said it so many times, and I'll continue to say it, is that when we say in government that we are committed to continuing to walk in the path of reconciliation in partnership and in trust and respect, it really reminds me of the power of those words and the impact all over government. I mean, in my previous role as an immigration minister, I had a role in implementing namely two of the recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And coming into the role, I didn't think I would be impacted by those recommendations, but I did. And it shows that it was truly and continues to be a whole of government approach. And I think, you know, the statement of reconciliation and always striving to do better there, and using history to inform our responsibilities for today is really, really powerful and informative and makes you humble, because you realize that there's so much work to be done, even though we've made a lot of progress. So I thank you for that. Ma dernière question est pour Xavier Rosalie. Xavier, votre projet consiste à supporter des projets par et pour les jeunes pour l'avancement des objectifs de développement durable. Pouvez-vous partager quelques recommandations pour atteindre les ODD mis de l'avant par les jeunes avec qui vous avez collaboré?
Merci Monsieur Hussen pour cette question. En fait, depuis 2018, les carrefours jeunesse-emploi, ils consultent les jeunes sur l'ensemble du territoire québécois dans le but de faire remonter les enjeux individuels et collectifs qu'ils identifient dans leur communauté par le biais du mouvement Ma Voix Compte, dont vous avez parlé. Ma Voix Compte, rien qu'en 2018, c'est plus de 5000 jeunes qui ont été consultés à travers plus de 200 activités de consultation. Donc, les exemples de recommandations que je vais vous partager sont le fruit de ces consultations. Donc, concernant le 4e objectif de développement durable, soit d'assurer l'accès de tous à une éducation de qualité sur un pied d'égalité et promouvoir les possibilités d'apprentissage tout au long de sa vie, les jeunes ont identifié l'importance de favoriser l'inclusion et valoriser la diversité des profils de jeunesse. Pour ce faire, il est important de mettre en lumière et de soutenir les différentes méthodes et lieux d'apprentissage. On parle ici d'écoles de la seconde chance, d'éducation aux adultes, de l'apprentissage à distance, de valoriser l'expérientiel et de favoriser la conciliation études, travail et vie personnelle. Il a également été identifié que le Canada doit miser sur la réussite éducative dans son ensemble et non seulement sur la réussite scolaire. De plus, l'éducation en général doit mettre l'accent sur des apprentissages préparant à la vie adulte en maximisant les opportunités pour comprendre et assimiler les différentes sphères qui composent la société, comme justement la finance, les impôts, la lecture médiatique, etc. Concernant le 8e objectif de développement durable, soit promouvoir une croissance économique soutenue, partagée et durable, le plein emploi productif et un travail décent pour tous, les jeunes ont identifié la nécessité de transformer les modes de production et de consommation et entamer une transition écologique favorisant la création d'emplois durables. Ceux-ci ont également mis l'accent sur le besoin d'accompagnement des jeunes voulant entreprendre, qu'il était indispensable de leur fournir un accompagnement professionnel individualisé et personnalisé et de valoriser l'entrepreneuriat social. Il a également été identifié, comme il a été dit plus tôt, le besoin de combattre la discrimination systémique des jeunes à l'embauche. Puis enfin, toujours dans le cadre du mouvement Ma Voix Compte, un comité environnement s'est rejoint la semaine dernière au sein du Carrefour Jeunesse-Emploi de Longueuil, où des jeunes ont été consultés sur le sujet de l'environnement et de la lutte contre le réchauffement climatique. Les jeunes consultés ont soulevé l'importance d'éduquer le plus tôt possible les jeunes sur les bonnes habitudes de vie à intégrer dans son quotidien pour prendre soin de notre environnement. Ils et elles ont également mis en avant le besoin de revoir les cursus scolaires pour les tourner vers les savoirs nécessaires pour être un bon citoyen, en sensibilisant et en accompagnant les jeunes. On parle ici d'aborder, par exemple, le sujet de la consommation responsable dans le cadre de cours dédiés. L'installation de panneaux solaires sur le plus de toitures possible, faire la promotion et l'organisation des ateliers sur l'autosuffisance alimentaire, favoriser l'éco-fiscalité, soit en instaurant de plus grosses taxes sur les produits suremballés. Ce sont toutes des solutions techniques qui ont été identifiées par les jeunes. Donc, comme vous pouvez le constater, les jeunes ont mis le doigt sur des enjeux, tout en proposant des solutions pour pallier à ceci. Il est très important de consulter les jeunes, mais il faut surtout les accompagner pour en faire des acteurs de changement dans le cadre de l'atteinte des objectifs de développement durable. Donc, voici ma réponse à votre question, Monsieur Hussen.
Merci, Xavier. J'ai pris bonne note de leurs recommandations. I always say that youth are not the leaders of tomorrow, they're the leaders of today. And to be honest, if we have any chance of solving and confronting the challenges that we face today as a society, whether it is climate change, whether it is eliminating homelessness or fighting and reducing chronic poverty from our country, we need youth leadership, and we need their wisdom and their enthusiasm and passion. I have one final question for all of you. J'ai une dernière question ouverte pour vous two. What do you think the greatest benefit of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development is for all Canadians? So I'll start with Gisèle, and then Vivek, Paul, and then Xavier.
Merci, Monsieur Hussen. J'aimerais juste dire que ce qui se passe avec le mouvement alimentaire sur le terrain, vous avez entendu Xavier, des exemples aussi, c'est vraiment ce qui est le plus inspirant, et que la politique alimentaire du Canada est alliée avec les objectifs de développement durable. Donc, c'est une chance de travailler en horizontal, tant au gouvernement, entre les ministères, qu'entre paliers du gouvernement, le fédéral, les provinces, les territoires, les municipalités, les gouvernements autochtones aussi, et aussi entre partis politiques. Il faut travailler entre les partis politiques. Donc, sinon, on n'arrivera pas. On a juste 9 ans. Merci.
Yeah, I think it's a very pertinent question, Minister Hussen. I see it, I guess, in three distinct phases. One would be that our plan, Canada's plan to achieve the SDG 2030 goals, should really focus across giving access to a diverse range of populations, you know, both the Canadian public, but also focusing mainly on marginalized and vulnerable populations, to ways in which they can, in fact, empower themselves and sustainably empower themselves to fight against discrimination. This happens, I guess, through the second phase, where I think sensitization and awareness around what it means to build digital literacy, what it means to take perspectives of others. How do you build moral engagement? How do you create empathy? And, you know, there's a lot that's been written, a lot that's been researched, but very often we don't take into account the strategies that are born from the communities themselves. How are they working to empower themselves? And I think this work needs to be really focused on. And I think finally, the opportunity for multi-stakeholder collaborations is immense here. I think SDG 2030, especially through SDG 17 with partnerships, is demonstrating that unless we can bring community members in touch with stakeholders in public policy, in mental health, in social services, in public safety, to work together to discover where exactly they need to concentrate their efforts to end discrimination, to reduce instances of prejudice. If we can't work on that in a sustained and in an urgent fashion, as Gisèle points out, then I think we are not going to be able to meet those goals. But we have the power to do so now. We have the funding to make this happen. And I think that we need now the recognition from the broader public that they need to come together with us. Merci.
Minister, I think a very important variable for us is materiality. And I would say that, you know, us in the Indigenous context, and then more broadly in the broader Canadian context. And what I mean is the ability to set and operationalize, you know, realistic, pragmatic, aggressive, specific sector-based targets that will, I think, further enable us as Canadians, and to your point, across the gender continuum and the generational continuum, to understand, drive towards, for me, increasingly importantly, to measure, and then I think to aggregate our contributions to our shared social and environmental goals. And I think having that coordinated and integrated framework is fundamentally important for us if we are going to make progress. And I think it's and in an Indigenous framework, I think it's medicine. I think ultimately the opportunity for us Canadians is that this is medicine for some ailments that we have, and as a dad and grandpa, I think it's medicine for the ailment of climate anxiety, in certainly in our communities, and social inequality, and to the degree to which we can align our trajectory towards our SDG 2030 goals and continue to understand and design and implement similar goals in pursuit of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. I think there's incredible synergistic opportunity to bring increased shared focus. And the last, I think, Minister, is that this is a time for intergenerational thinking. And I think having the 2030 goals, notwithstanding that it's only 9 years away, shifts the way that we think about this effort, and perhaps would invite us to think generationally. And I think there's a level of readiness around that, particularly given the level of attention, love, and honor that is increasing for the elders that we have in Canadian society, and the shift in the way that we're thinking and feeling about the intergenerational relationships in this country.
Et merci Monsieur Hussen pour la question. Donc, nous partageons la volonté d'avoir une approche inclusive dans la mise en œuvre nationale des objectifs de développement durable, tout en souhaitant favoriser un leadership partagé entre tous les acteurs de la société, comme le disait Gisèle justement. Il faudra travailler fort pour s'assurer qu'aucun jeune ne soit laissé de côté, comme vous l'avez dit au début de votre allocution, et que ceux-ci soient directement au cœur de la démarche, en développant leur pouvoir d'agir tout au long des processus et en passant de la sensibilisation jusqu'à l'action. Si l'ambition est là, il faudra lui donner quand même du corps. Il faut s'assurer que les jeunes puissent incarner la démarche en favorisant la déclinaison locale et l'appropriation territoriale. De plus, nous devons sortir des carcans et des silos et aborder les 17 objectifs de développement durable de façon intégrée pour mener une démarche intersectorielle avec une approche globale pour accompagner la jeunesse et la société civile dans toutes leurs sphères de leur vie. Le Canada a en effet besoin de toute la créativité des jeunes, comme vous l'avez dit, Monsieur Hussen, pour construire ce monde. L'économie du 21e siècle aura grand besoin de tous ces citoyens capables de créer, travailler, entreprendre, décider et innover, afin de combler des besoins essentiels et légitimes, de façon efficace et équitable, en harmonie avec la dynamique de nos écosystèmes. Il nous faut réinventer un vivre ensemble qui reforme nos savoir-être et nos savoir-faire dans nos façons de consommer, se nourrir, se loger, se vêtir, se transporter ou même se soigner, surtout dans le contexte actuel. Nous souhaitons contribuer à jeter les bases d'un Canada moderne pour les futures générations. En tant que réseau national, nous sommes en capacité d'accompagner et de faciliter cette démarche justement sur l'ensemble du territoire québécois. Puis je voudrais ajouter pour la fin que j'ai entendu tous mes collègues justement donner leur point de vue, et cela résonne beaucoup avec notre vision que nous avons au sein de notre réseau. Donc nous sommes plus que partants pour travailler ensemble en co-construction pour favoriser cette approche inclusive et de leadership partagé pour l'atteinte des objectifs de développement durable au niveau national. Merci à vous.
Merci beaucoup.
Merci tout le monde. Merci, Monsieur le Ministre. I'm conscious that I have done an absolutely abysmal job at moderating this because we're crushing against time. But if I could ask the Indulgence Minister just for steal a few extra more minutes from you and the panelists. Okay. So we did get some questions in from stakeholders and from outside as this is going on. There is one question that I would like to put to you. And just because we have a hard stop with technology, I'll ask you to be quite brief if you don't mind, everyone, with your answers. But Minister, I'd like to put this to you first before turning to the panelists. What has COVID-19 taught us about the importance of the 2030 Agenda and the Sustainable Development Goals? And this is a question that's come to us for you to answer.
I think it's very timely to actually think about that, because the COVID-19 pandemic has exposed and made worse existing gaps, existing inequalities, existing challenges like housing and poverty and so on. And it actually goes in really well with those realizations, go in hand with the strategies that improve health and education and reduce inequality and spur economic growth, inclusive growth, that the SDGs call for. So the unifying thread throughout the SDGs, the 17 goals, is the commitment to ending poverty. The SDGs are about meeting people's needs for a safe home, a safe education, a decent job, quality healthcare, a healthy environment. All of those things have been exposed now even more because of the COVID-19 pandemic. Let me give you an example. We've asked people to stay at home to contain the spread of COVID-19 pandemic. Well, if you don't have a safe and affordable place to call home, how can you then stay home? If you don't have a decent job, how can you survive the pandemic? If you don't have access to quality healthcare and so on. So I think the SDGs are very, very connected to our government's ability to not only support Canadians through the pandemic, but actually recover better. I have always said this, and I'll repeat this again. We cannot go back to normal after the pandemic because normal was part of the problem. We have to build better, and we have to build in a more inclusive manner. And that's what the SDGs are all about. So there's a lot of synergy between the two, and I'm actually seeing that even in this discussion.
Thank you very much. So I'll throw the challenge down to our four panelists, starting with Gisèle, for maybe just like almost a 1-2 sentence answer in the interest of time. Gisèle.
The urgency of social justice, economic justice, and environmental justice. If we don't have a viable planet to live on, we're not going to get very far. Yeah. It's urgent.
Well done. Thank you very much. Vivek.
I think a reorientation on humanism is where I see the COVID pandemic and its effect on magnifying polarizations that existed in our society. If we can't reorient our discussions towards how we can employ humanism first and foremost, before thinking of other social, political, economic, cultural factors that impact our well-being, then I think we're going to be going down the wrong path.
Thank you very much. Xavier.
Oui, ben, j'ai beaucoup aimé justement le point sur le fait qu'on ne peut pas revenir à la normale parce que ce qui était avant faisait partie du problème justement. Comme il a été dit par Gisèle et Vivek, plutôt se concentrer sur l'humain, sur ne serait-ce que se poser la question de il faut que tout le monde ait droit à une vie digne, et digne inclut justement toutes ces notions d'inclusion, de lutter contre la discrimination systémique, etc. Donc c'est ça, c'est vraiment ça vers où il faut s'en aller justement. C'est ce que nous a montré, a mis en exergue la pandémie, et ce sur quoi on doit travailler avec les objectifs de développement durable justement.
Merci beaucoup, c'est bien précis. Et le dernier mot, ou presque dernier mot, for Paul.
I think it's really the opportunity for rematriation, and I think it's one of the most beautiful medicines in the reconciliation movement is to reclaim a matriarchy and a matriarchy-led system of decision-making, economic decision-making, social decision-making, and I think it's perfectly aligned in that core epistemological kinship between reconciliation, the SDGs, and the UN DRIP. And the sooner that we can get there and accelerate our agenda and process of rematriation, the better we'll be.
Merci beaucoup. Ceci conclut cette période de questions. It's all the time we have, and I'm so sorry. It's been such an incredible conversation from you and amongst you, and a great event. I would like to thank our four guests for sharing your insights with all of Canada today and with us here. Merci à vous tous et tous également qui nous suivez sur les médias sociaux. But I would like to turn the last words over, please, to Minister Hussen for closing remarks. Thank you, Minister, for this event today.
Merci, Catherine. Thank you very much. Today's event has been an insightful look into the tireless work underway in Canada to help advance our progress on the Sustainable Development Goals. À l'ère de l'avant, ensemble consiste à créer des opportunités pour que chacun et chacune puisse participer à l'avancement du développement durable et agir d'une manière qui soit significative pour sa communauté. Moving forward together is about creating opportunities for everyone to be part of advancing sustainable development and act in ways that are meaningful for them and their communities. I want to say a special thank you to our guests for providing their personal reflections, insights, and experiences on working on the SDGs. To the SDG stakeholder community who champion this work on a daily basis, and to everyone who tuned in to learn more about moving forward together. Canada's 2030 Agenda National Strategy. L'événement d'aujourd'hui a été une occasion unique pour nous de réfléchir, de partager des idées et de nous inspirer de la manière dont nous pouvons contribuer collectivement à la construction d'un avenir plus durable. Today's event has been a valuable opportunity for us to reflect, share ideas, and get inspired about how we can collectively contribute to building a more sustainable future. Les objectifs de développement durable nous indiquent la voie à suivre au-delà de la pandémie vers un monde plus sain, plus prospère et plus inclusif. The Sustainable Development Goals lay out a path for us past the global pandemic towards a healthier, more prosperous, and inclusive world. Achieving the SDGs will be challenging. The vision set out in Moving Forward Together is one of determination and teamwork. Merci à tous et passez une bonne fin de semaine. Thank you very much for your time today and have a great weekend, everyone. Merci beaucoup.